Hey everybody, this is a chronology from the back of In the Crossfire, Adventures of a Vietnamese Revolutionary by Ngô Văn. I'm going to mess up a lot of pronunciations here, and chronology. It's no exaggeration to say that a colonial war began the moment French troops landed in Indochina in 1859 and never stopped. Once established, the colonial regime engaged in an ongoing battle against the peasant and worker masses, who remained in open or latent revolt until the French and then the Americans were finally driven out more than a century later. The following chronology, mostly drawn from Ngô Van's Vietnam 1920 to 1945, and from the British edition of an earlier text by Ngô Văn, Revolutionaries They Could Not Break, mentions only a few of the more significant events in order to help orient the reader. So here we go. 1615, Jesuit missionaries first set foot in Indochina. In order to facilitate the introduction of Christianity, they created Quoc Ngu, a romanized transcript of Vietnamese to replace Chu Nam, the traditional Chinese writing system which used Chinese-style ideograms and which had not been generally accessible to the common people. As in many other regions, Christianity and trade prepare the way for eventual colonial conquest. 1857 to 1870. French Emperor Napoleon III launches a, quote, Catholic crusade, end quote, on the pretext of protecting the Catholics persecuted by the Emperor of Vietnam, Tu Duc. Saigon is taken in 1859 and the port is opened to French merchant ships. Tu Duc calls on the people to resist the foreign invaders. Revolts spread throughout Cochin, China, which is part of Vietnam. I forget all the names of the three. I think there's three. I think there's Cochin, China, Amman, or Annam, and yes, Annam. I'm not sure all the places. Annam, Cochin, China, and Tonkin. The French respond with massacres and the process of annexation continues. 1870 to 1893. After the fall of Napoleon III in July 1870 and the crushing of the Paris Commune, May 1871, the French Third Republic resumes the conquest. In 1874, Tu Duc is forced to sign a treaty of, quote, peace, friendship, and perpetual alliance between France and the Kingdom of Annam, end quote, that obliges him to recognize French sovereignty over Cochin, China, to open the Red River for French commerce with China, and to open the ports of Quy Nhon, Haiphong, and Hanoi. Tonkin, however, is not yet subdued, and its conquest continues under the government of Jules Ferry, who lived from 1880 to... No, not who lived. Tonkin, however, is not yet subdued, and its conquest continues under the government of Jules Ferry, who lived between 1880 and 1885. Ferry, one of the butchers of the Paris Commune, declares, quote, the superior races have the duty to civilize the inferior races, end quote. Jules Ferry also notes that by a fortunate coincidence, this noble duty will also generate some more mundane benefits. Quote, Europe today can be considered as a commercial enterprise that is facing declining profits. European consumption is saturated. New sectors of consumers must be cultivated. Colonies are the most advantageous investment opportunities for the capital of rich countries, end quote. 1893. France has now conquered all of what becomes known as French Indochina, consisting of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The colonizers divide Vietnam into three categories: Tonkin in the north, capital Hanoi; Annam in the center, capital Hue, or Hue, H-U-E, I guess it's Hue; and Cochin, China in the south, capital Saigon. Tonkin and Annam are protectorates, as are Cambodia and Laos. Cochin, China is a colony. The quote, French protectorates, end quote, the quote, French protected, end quote, Tonkinites and Annamites are formally under the administration of the native rulers and subjected to feudal judicial regimes whose punishments include a whole range of tortures. The Cochin Chinese, referred to as, quote, French subjects, end quote, are under direct French administration and officially governed according to a modified version of the French Penal Code. In reality, however, they are subjected to the same sorts of arbitrary brutalities as those in the protectorates. French profits are based on the exploitation of natural resources, coal, minerals, rubber, rice, cotton, and cheap labor. The country also serves as a monopoly market for industrial products manufactured in France. In addition to the, quote, normal functioning of the economy, an incredible level of corruption prevails. Among numerous other schemes involving land purchases, construction contracts, etc., the colonial administration often grant monopolies on particular products to themselves. Colonial administrators often grant monopolies on particular products to themselves or their cronies, then impose consumption quotas on local populations to increase their profits. The colonial domination undermines the feudal agrarian economy based on the so-called, quote, Asiatic mode of production, end quote, by introducing capitalist production, thereby engendering new social classes comparable to those of the ruling country, though with certain different characteristics. It should be noted that there's debate about the degree of capitalist development in France, even, which a lot of people, some people would say, you couldn't even officially completely say France was capitalist until the late 19th century. Other people dispute that, obviously. Where am I? The peasantry, which comprises the immense majority of the population, is exploited by the large landowners. Constantly on the verge of starvation, the massive peasants are bled dry, not only by native landowners, but by various taxes imposed by the colonial regime, especially the personal, quote, capitation, end quote, tax. An agricultural proletariat develops in the rice fields, the domains allotted to large enterprises, rubber plantations, etc., and in the lands belonging to the Catholic mission, working under contract labor conditions that often verge on slavery. Quote, the workers wake up at 3 a.m., assemble at 4 a.m., and work till nightfall. The worker is tied to a plantation for 3 years by a drastic contract that forbids him to work for any other employer during that period. Signing on at 0.4 piasters, Piasters per day. He is unaware that after paying for his ration of rice, reimbursing his advances, and paying various fines, his net earnings at the end of the month turn out to be far less than the sum of his daily wages, end quote. Official report on the Mimo rubber plantation by Labor Inspector Delamar, March 1928. The masters have the right of life and death over the workers, and the plantations generally have their own private prisons and dungeons. Alongside, there develops a totally new industrial proletariat in the mines and in the large companies of public works, electricity, cement, distilleries, and transport. These workers have no organizations and no political experience, but gradually become radicalized, specialized, especially in the cities. The European and Chinese bourgeoisie lead and dominate the native bourgeoisie. The native bourgeoisie and landowners support the colonial regime to which they owe their prosperity. A large part of the native petty bourgeoisie is incorporated into the administrative and military apparatus. 1904, Phan Boi Chau founds the Vietnamese Modernization Society aimed at expelling the French and establishing a constitutional monarchy under the rebel prince Cong Dae. The following year, Phan Boi Chau and Cong Dae escaped to Japan, where Phan Boi Chau and Cong Dae unsuccessfully attempt to enlist Japanese aid. 1912. Phan Boi Chau, now in exile in China, founds the Vietnam Restoration Society, which incites several assassinations and abortive revolts in Vietnam. 1920s. A group of Vietnamese immigrants in Paris are referred to by their compatriots as, quote, the Five Dragons, end quote. Phan Chau Trinh, Phan Van Trong, Nguyen the Truyen, or Nguyen Te, or the, I don't know, sorry, Nguyen An Nin, Nguyen I Quoc, hereafter referred to as, quote, Ho Chi Minh, end quote, the name he adopted in 1942. Though of diverse backgrounds and perspectives, their denunciations of colonial subjugation and their determination to liberate their country lay the groundwork for the, quote, Indo-Chinese Revolution, end quote, of the 1930s. All of them returned to Vietnam and openly defy the colonial regime except for Ho Chi Minh, who remains outside the country, shuttling between Moscow and China. He has not returned until 1941. Meanwhile, the French Communist Party sends a number of other emigrant Vietnamese students to Moscow to be trained as professional revolutionaries. They will become the Stalinist cadres of the future Chinese Communist Party. 1923 to 1926. In Cochin, China, Nguyen An Nin publishes La Cloche Fêlée with the ironic subtitle, Journal for the Propagation of French Ideas. Seeing Vietnam is smothered by oppressive surveillance, he urges those who can to visit France. He urges those who can to visit France, or at least to become familiar with France's best traditions, so as to enlarge their horizons. In his view, although France is the source of colonial oppression, there is also a spirit of liberation to be found in the land of the Enlightenment, the Revolution, and the Paris Commune. In 1925, in Canton, China, under the patronage of the Third International, Ho Chi Minh founds the Tan Nien Kach Meng Dong Chi Hoi Revolutionary Youth League. Members are given rigorous ideological and practical training in China, then sent back to Vietnam. The Tan Nien takes root deeply among the peasantry, spreading from the north to the south. 1927. In Hanoi, a group of radical teachers and students from the Vietnam Quoc Dan Dang VNQDD/National Party of Vietnam, whose goal is to expel the French from Indochina, overthrow the native feudal system, and set up a democratic republic. As means, they advocate conspiracy, military plots, and terrorism. February 1930. The revolt of the infantry of Yen Bai in Tonkin, instigated by the VNQDD. The revolt is drowned in blood, and the VNQDD is virtually annihilated. The Tan Nien merges with other similar groups to form the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. May 1930 through early 1931. Thousands of peasants marched to administrative centers to demand the lowering of the capitation tax and the abolition of forced labor. The colonial regime responds by firing into the unarmed crowds. The peasants shift to more insurrectionary actions, attacking military posts and police stations, releasing prisoners, looting markets, destroying tax records, and executing particularly hated notables. In the Neon, NGHE space AN, Neon, and Ha Tin provinces of Annam, they organize themselves into, quote, Soviets, end quote, seizing land and distributing stockpiled food. These movements are largely spontaneous, but many involve significant ICP participation and influence. In the repression that follows, thousands of peasants are massacred, thousands more are imprisoned, and the Indo-Chinese Communist Party is severely damaged. (1930 to 1932). Inside the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, various oppositional tendencies criticize the constantly shifting Moscow-directed policies in which the party's popular base serves only as pawns for mass actions. These tendencies rallied to the, quote, left opposition, end quote. These tendencies rallied to the left opposition positions of Trotsky and Trotsky's followers, demanding independence and social revolution, land to the peasants and factories to the workers, whereas the Indo-Chinese Communist Party calls for independence first, with socialism to follow at some later stage. Among these oppositional currents is a group formed in Saigon in 1931 by Vietnamese students expelled from France. It is this group that Ngô Văn joins in 1932. April-May 1933. The trials of 21 activists of the left opposition and of 121 members of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party bring a temporary halt to the underground movement, most of the leaders being in prison or deported to forced labor sites. On the occasion of the Saigon City Council election, the Stalinists and Trotskyists, still at liberty, come together to create the weekly paper La Lutte, agreeing to refrain from mutual criticism in order to jointly confront the colonial regime on the legal terrain. The astonishing and unprecedented alliance, considering that in Russia and everywhere else in the world the Stalinist parties are calling for the extermination of Trotskyists, comes about in part because Ho Chi Minh and the upper Stalinist bureaucracy remain outside the country, with little possibility of directly controlling the rank-and-file party members within it, in part because the Vietnamese Trotskyists have stronger roots among the workers than do the Stalinists, making it difficult for the latter to employ their usual tactics, and in part because the partisans on both sides have shared extremely difficult conditions of struggle and are anxious to create some breathing room for themselves. 1935. After the Laval-Stalin Pact allying France and Russia, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, following the footsteps of the French Communist Party, no longer speaks of class struggle or of combating French imperialism. The Trotskyists in the La Lutte group, bound by their united front agreement with the Stalinists, remain silent. In protest against this surrender of principle, Lu San Han, Ngô Văn, and Trinh Van Lao found the League of Internationalist Communists for the construction of the Fourth International, and in a clandestine paper, Tien Dao introduced La Lutte's accommodation, denounce La Lutte's accommodation with the Stalinist betrayal. I'll get some water real quick. It's a beautiful morning. Where am I? 1936 to 1937, the Popular Front takes power in France but declares its intention to maintain France's colonial empire. In Vietnam, widespread action committees tried to convene a, quote, Indo-Chinese Congress, end quote, that will present their demands to the Popular Front. These committees are soon repressed. A massive wave of strikes follows and is also repressed. On orders from Moscow, the French Communist Party pressures the Vietnamese Stalinists to break with the Trotskyists. The Stalinists quit La Lutte and immediately found another paper, La Avant-Garde, in which they denounced their recent Trotskyist allies as, quote, twin brothers of fascism, end quote. 1938 to 1939. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party adopts a fervently patriotic position supporting the colonial government's campaign for the defense of French Indochina against the Japanese threat by taking part in the launching of a war of Jesus Christ. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party adopts a fervently patriotic position supporting the colonial government's campaign for the defense of French Indochina against the Japanese threat by taking part in the launching of a war loan drive and by approving the regime's conscription of an additional 20,000 Vietnamese soldiers. As a result of this unpopular position, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, which has made an alliance with the bourgeois Constitutionalist Party in the Colonial Council election, is defeated in April 1939. The Trotskyists, on the other hand, get 3 delegates elected despite an explicitly radical platform. Ho Chi Minh is infuriated by the Trotskyist victory. In May 1939, from Guilin, China, Ho Chi Minh writes a series of letters to his comrades in Vietnam vilifying the Trotskyists and parroting the delirious and murderous propaganda accompanying the recent Moscow trials, letters which are published in the Stalinist Hanoi paper, Note Void. Some excerpts. Quote, the Trotskyists of China and other countries, are nothing but a band of evildoers, the lapdogs of international fascism. In collusion with the police and their Japanese masters, the Trotskyists infiltrate workers' strikes in Shanghai and use every possible means to sabotage the movement. In Spain, they call themselves the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, POUM. It is they who constitute the nest of spies in Madrid and Barcelona and other places in the service of Franco. It is they who organized the famous Fifth Column, the espionage organization of the Italian and German fascist army. The French Trotskyists are plotting to sabotage the Popular Front. Have you read the accusations against the Trotskyists at their trial in the Soviet Union? Doing so will help you see the true repugnant face of Trotskyism and the Trotskyists. They must be politically exterminated. End quote. 1940. The Hitler-Stalin Pact, August 1939, leads to a new about-face of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. The Stalinist focus is once again on the struggle against French imperialism while the menace of fascism is played down. Although Nazi Germany is on the verge of invading China and Japan is on the verge of invading Indochina. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party accordingly launches a peasant insurrection in Cochin, China, which is drowned in blood. Thousands are killed or imprisoned and hundreds of others are condemned to death. 1940 to 1945. The Japanese occupy Indochina and allow the pro-Vichy French colonial administration to continue to maintain order, leaving the Japanese free to invade Siam, Burma, Malaysia, etc. 1941. Ho Chi Minh puts aside the communist label and creates the Viet Minh, Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi Front for the independence of Vietnam. He eliminates class struggle and agrarian revolution from his program so as not to upset the bourgeoisie and landowners who Ho Chi Minh hopes to include in this front. Despite the new label, the Viet Minh is effectively a continuation of the ICP. Or Indo-Chinese Communist Party. Not the insane clown posse. 1941 to 1944. Following Hitler's invasion of Russia in June 1941, Ho Chi Minh once again focuses on the, quote, war against fascism, end quote, and seeks alliances with the Allies, including the, quote, Free French, end quote, forces under General de Gaulle and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, which provides him with arms and advisors. August 1945. The Japanese take over the administration of Indochina, shunting aside the previously tolerated French colonial regime and presenting themselves as liberators from Western domination. August 1945. The Japanese surrender. The Allies decide that Vietnam will be occupied by the Chinese troops of Chiang Kai-shek in the north and by Anglo-Indian troops of General Gracie in the south, with the understanding that the country will be handed back to the French as soon as possible. Before the arrival of the occupation troops, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, profiting from the political vacuum, takes power in Hanoi, organizes a hunt down of Trotskyists, quote, traitors to the homeland, end quote, destroys the workers' councils formed by miners at Hongai Kampha, and it prevents the famine-stricken peasants from seizing and redistributing land. Meanwhile, Saigon enters into a state of effervescence. Amid a variety of popular networks and new or revived radical or nationalist groupings, the Stalinist leader, Tran Van Giao, appoints himself the head of a, quote, provisional executive committee, end quote. Several nationalist groups rally to this Viet Minh-dominated government. On August 25th, a huge demonstration takes place in the center of Saigon. Ngô Văn and other members of the League of Internationalist Communists take part, demanding, quote, all power to the People's Committees, end quote, popular committees that have been spontaneously springing up in the city, challenging the authority of Tran Van Giao and his political police and armed gangs. September 1945. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh proclaims the independence of Vietnam, while in Saigon the Viet Minh organizes a military parade and calls on the population to welcome the Allied troops of General Gracie. Once in the city, Gracie contemptuously kicks the Viet Minh's, quote, provisional executive committee, end quote, out of the governor's palace and rearms the French colonists. The Viet Minh forces abandon the city and establish themselves in the neighboring countryside, urging the people to, quote, remain calm, end quote, while the provisional government seeks to negotiate with the invading forces. Meanwhile, the masses of ordinary people of Saigon, refusing to accept the return of the detested colonizers, seek in every possible way to arm themselves so as to drive them out of the city. Ngô Văn and his comrades are of exactly the same mind. September 23rd, 1945. Insurrection in Saigon. The people of Saigon set up barricades all over the city against the French. After several days of street fighting, the French gained control of the city, but the insurgents control all the surrounding areas. Pursued both by vengeful French colonists and by the Stalinists, Ngô Văn and his League comrades regroup outside Saigon and join the workers' militia, a fighting unit created by the streetcar workers to combat the French while remaining independent of the Stalinists and Nationalists. 1945 to 1946. In the South, the Viet Minh kill every Trotskyist they can get their hands on, then attack the Cao Dai and Ho Hao religious sects and other independent armed groups who are opposing the return of the French. In the North, Ho Chi Minh allies himself with the Chinese occupation troops in order to maintain his power, then welcomes the return of French troops in order to get rid of the Chinese. After killing virtually all the Trotskyists, Ho Chi Minh destroys all other nationalist movements and radical tendencies, thereby establishing Ho Chi Minh's total political power in the North and his total control over the resistance in the South. Thus it stands on the eve of the 30-Year War. Thanks for listening.